Dr. Darlene Russell is Professor of English Education in the College of Education at William Patterson University. She teaches English methods, literacy, and educational leadership courses. She is the founder of Nurturing Culturally Responsive Equity Teachers Research Project, which focuses on decolonizing the curriculum through culturally responsive and humanizing pedagogies. Dr. Russell is also the founder of My Sister's Nest, a mentoring group for Black and Brown female college students. She was the recipient of the 2015 William Patterson University's Women of Vision Award. She was the recipient of the 2020 Educator of the Year Award from the New Jersey Council of Teachers of English, and the recipient of the 2020 New Jersey Governor's Award in Arts Education. Dr. Russell is a professor and a Fulbright scholar. She is the author of books, journals, articles, book chapters, and book reviews. She has an established record of presenting her research at national and international conferences. In light of the health crisis and accelerated movements against institutionalized racism that presently engulf the nation, Dr. Russell is even more assiduous in her work to attack white supremacy in education and produce anti-racist educators. She currently serves as an executive board member for 3 national organizations which focus on education, literacy, and social justice. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Darlene Russell.
Thank you, Dean Ginsburg, for that introduction. I want to thank the entire partnership, the NJCU, TC, NJ, WPU-NJ partnership, the conference planning committee, and everyone who was a part of making this event possible. I want to also thank my comrades and mentors who I deeply admire. They've been a sounding board, think partners, and truly confidants over the years. And I'm grateful to them. I want to acknowledge them. So it's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and I am going to get ready to share my screen. I think over the last several months, I've become this technological DJ where I'm able to move from place to place and screen to screen. So I am going to go forward and share my screen with you all. I want to share something before we go forward into these slides. I want to acknowledge our Gen Zs. I want to acknowledge you for moving forward during these uncertain times. You are weathering remote learning, hybrid schedules, not seeing your friends much, and other anxiety-provoking concerns. Your ability to adapt and to persist is worthy of noting. So I see you and I acknowledge you. I want to share these slides with you. This has been an unprecedented and tumultuous year, and the year is not even over. With the COVID-19 pandemic, the piercing lament against systemic racism and white supremacy, which is a part of the DNA of this country, and the contentious presidential election. This is historical times that all of us are witnessing. So again, I really acknowledge you, for future educators, for persisting. So these are just additional slides that capture what's been going on in our nation. And I will talk more about this particular slide later. This is the title of my talk with you this afternoon, Being First, the Task, the Cost, and the promise. I'm from a bunch of firsts, and this is a mini gallery of family firsts. My dad, who's pictured here, along with two fellow sailors, desegregated a motel in Yorktown, Virginia, the weekend after he graduated from boot camp in the Navy. My mom was the first to graduate seminary. My grandmother, pictured on the far right, was the first Black woman to buy a multi-family house in a Hasidic community in Brooklyn. My cousin, pictured here, is the family's first professional boxer and to be featured on ESPN this past summer. My daughter was the first to be on a rowing team and coxswain, and navigated her team to victory at the head of the Charles in Boston. Being the first means a few things. I just pinpointed 3 things here, and I want to talk today about being the first to be an anti-racist teacher, perhaps being the first in your family, your school district, your community. This trifecta, the task, the cost, and the promise, are embedded in these 3 things listed here. Having courage to carry the burden and the joy of justice work. That means intentionally moving forward in spite of fears, the unknown, and not even having a script. It also means standing alone and not being afraid to stand alone, not having the support, and maybe not even being seen. Becoming a change producer, keeping your hand on the plow, which means going beyond what's comfortable, what's familiar, what's norm, what's easy in order to produce change. So it's being committed for the long haul. And in that mini gallery of firsts, all of my family members had to exhibit each one of these, and I've had to exhibit each one of these in my work. Please take a moment and scan these important quotes. Well, they're important to me because they really reverberate my work and what I embrace and wholeheartedly believe in. I am really intentional about carrying this out in my curricular decisions, culturally sustaining pedagogies and what that means. And a colleague of mine who's dear to me shared that we have to disrupt. We have to prepare students to disrupt this system because this present system is not working for everyone. So this is what I'm about, and I am very intentional in my interactions with students and grooming them to be teachers of change, and not being trendy, but being enduring. And there is a difference. So this work cannot be performatory. It must be honest and ongoing. It's a stance and not a performance. And we don't even have the luxury of being neutral. I think it's really important to begin to think about who you are if you want to be an anti-racist educator. And that's the goal. So if you want to be a culturally responsive, a culturally relevant educator, you have to think about who you are. And part of that is thinking about what do I represent? What do I believe? Who am I? And that is delving into our racial identity development. And there's a scholar, an established scholar who talks about racial identity development, Janet Helms. You have to get to know who you are first before you get to know who your students are. And knowing self is about self-care. So in order to be a culturally responsive teacher, you have to do this. and then relationships can be built. But without delving into who you are, who you represent, how do you really show up to the world? How do people perceive you? Which moves us into social cultural consciousness. And that is our thinking, our behaving, and our whole beings are deeply steeped into factors such as race, ethnicity, social class, gender, language, and other identifiers. So it doesn't come from the thin air, it comes from somewhere, our positionality. So understanding what that means and who you represent and unpacking those things, which leads us to speaking up and speaking out, because we're talking about social justice work and being advocates of change. If we see something, and we've seen this, this mantra or this motto on trains and commercials, etc. If you see something, say something. So as an anti-racist educator, if I see something that is askew, that's injustice, I have an obligation to say something, to do something, to act upon it. So that ranges from racial microaggressions with students, staff, all of those things, to other sorts of acts. So people of color can even reinforce and reproduce whiteness and white supremacist ideologies. So that's not just reserved for white people. And they can also microaggress against people of color. So it's really thinking about where injustice occurs and how can you penetrate, integrate those areas, right? I think also critical reflection is a part of this as well. This is something that's ongoing, and you're going to see this in my slides to come, that one must be able to really deeply analyze who they are and think about their actions. And I have a dear colleague of mine who works with teachers, and she's an assistant principal. And she was telling me sometime last year that the teachers in her school building are not critical reflecting. They're just not. They don't see the nexus, the connection of what they do in the classroom and how that impacts students' behavior, their academic experiences. They don't see the connection. So they're not engaged in this ongoing critical reflection at all. And that's her analysis of the situation. And that's something that we have to think about. And that's something that's ongoing. It's a lifelong commitment in this field because it's going to determine one's growth and development. I want to take a moment and look at this screen, this slide rather. So as we curriculum plan as culturally responsive teachers in training or those who are on the journey, we have to think about whose voices and epistemologies are being centered and how they are being presented. What texts are you using? Who are you quoting? And how are you quoting them? And why are you quoting them? So it's really this perpetual questioning of what you're doing in the classroom. So thinking about your practice and thinking about how that's going to look and show up in the classroom. Who is silenced? Who is erased? And why? So I love what the National Council of Teachers of English phrased how we can revolutionize the curricula. And that means looking at our instructional models, looking at our practices, looking at our assessment practices and approaches. So as an English educator, I'm really calculated in my selection of texts. So I'm very intentional about that. So it's not done adventitiously or fortuitously. It's done with great intentionality. So what I do is I try to create a balance of texts that have struggle in it and joy. That's the balance that I try to create. So I'm not into, and I'm not advocating this as well, I'm not into what's called trauma porn. So traumatizing the experience, focusing on the trauma experiences of BIPOC folks. That's not what it's about. Or what a colleague of mine phrased as perseverance porn. So being very intentional about what type of balance you create in the classroom. So it's being some type of a social justice alchemist. So you're creating some type of chemistry there. So you're looking at the voices and how they are presented. Is it from a deficit point of view? Is it from a servitude point of view? Is it from a power point of view? All of those things have to be considered. And that leads into scenery. What is your scenery like? What is your digital scenery like in your classroom, right? Now that we're online. What's the physical scenery in your classroom? I was in a classroom nearly 2 years ago, and there was no representation of people of color on the walls at all. High school classroom that served students of color. That was problematic. So those are things that we have to think about as we go forward, as you go forward in thinking about your craft, thinking about who you want to be and how you're going to bring the world into your classroom. How are you going to do that? And of course, that requires ongoing critical reflection. That's something that is reverberated throughout, pardon me. Okay, good. That's something that's reverberated throughout these slides. So thinking about the voices and the scenery. Let's move forward. This is what I call, one way I phrase this is epistemology producers, and that's what I want students to be. Featured here are 3 books that my students and I co-wrote. This is a part of project-based learning, and students were a part of this process from cover to cover. So that means the actual, every area of production of the text. So we all collaborated on how the cover of the text should look, what the intro should look like, what a dedication page should look like, the acknowledgements, the layout of the book, whose narrative should come first, the order, the whole stratification of the book. So each book, each one of these books is a collection of critical narratives about life experiences and issues that matter to students. So this is a part of culturally sustaining pedagogy, culturally responsive teaching, acknowledging the histories, the ontologies, the stories of students and what matters to them. So we connected this to a larger text that we were reading in the semester, and we looked at themes and we looked at what's important to us and what we want to talk about. And it's important, future educators, that you are a part of the process and that students see you as a writer, as a change producer. So my writing is featured in each one of these texts. And these books are registered with the Library of Congress. These are full functioning texts. And students also had the opportunity to engage in the writing process and also peer edit. So a lot of skill sets were being exercised, leadership, building their leadership acumen. All of those things were happening during this endeavor. So let's move forward. So looking at the classroom as a critical lab is really important. That's what I call it. It's a critical lab. It's an opportunity to, once we recognize who we are, we think about the curriculum and how we can redefine and reimagine the curriculum, right? This innovation that's happening. it's about also developing that racial lens. Now that I have a sense of who I am and how I show up to the world, I have to see race in our texts, in our practices. And this calls for what a colleague of mine, Cheryl Matthias, calls racial responsibility and truth-telling, which Geneva Gay and Gloria Latson-Billings talk about in their work. And this is essential in order to co-build a liberating and decolonizing curriculum. So this is interrupting whiteness, interrupting white supremacy in the curriculum and assessment practices and classroom culture. It's also about knowing the vernacular, so understanding the vernacular and what that means, right? So understanding race talk and what that means and your responsibility to that. And then once these things are developed, then systemic racism can be addressed and attacked in the classroom setting. So this is a part of decolonizing the curriculum. And text stretching involves bringing in multiple texts into the classroom. So that's social media posts, writings from the other side of the world, which is ultimately a text itself. We are living, breathing texts, all of us. So this is really important in terms of multiple voices as well. And in the next few slides, I'm going to show how I've done this in my classrooms. And this is something that you could perhaps consider as well. And I think a part of that conversation is teachers should be civically and politically engaged. And this is social justice work. It should not be a secret. Your stance should not be a secret. I think it's also important when we talk about critical classroom practice and classrooms as critical labs, we have to, and we're talking about culturally responsive and culturally relevant teaching and anti-racist practices, we have to think about discipline too, because that's a part of the equation. Teachers are what I call the frontliners. We're hearing about first responders and essential workers. Teachers are frontliners. So how are you responding to students' behaviors? Do you understand your own cultural norms and students' cultural norms and how they interface and maybe sort of clash, if you will? Understanding also, a part of that is understanding the disproportionate number of Black and Brown students, especially girls, who are criminalized and who are suspended for subjective reasons, the policing of their attire, their tone, their volume, all these things that are really fundamentally racist. So thinking about that, like, how do I respond? Do I know my students? Am I a part of perpetuating racist practices in my own classroom, reproducing racist practices in my own classroom? And really understanding the school to prison pipeline is an academic barrier and an economic barrier. So if I have a record, that's gonna dwindle my chances of securing profitable income or securing a position, a job. It's also about, again, perpetual critical reflection. That is something that's ongoing. And that's something that I inculcate to my students. And it's essential. I just want to add that in that first slide first few slides where it was a picture of the weight of the world, there are people who have done great things in our nation and in our world. And each one of those people, they use their voices to make impact despite who was in the White House, who was in government, who was in political office. So don't let someone who is in political office stymie you. It has nothing to do with it. So those folks forged forward up against all sorts of barriers, odds, and circumstances. And I think that's really important to note. I think it's important to think about being first and how will you be first in your schools to begin researching anti-racist teaching resources and decolonize the curriculum. Will you be the first in your school or family to really speak out against how racism impacts the educational experiences of BIPOC students? Will you be the first in your family or community, political party, church, or synagogue to speak about the educational and economic and physical violence against minoritized communities? Will you be the first to have deep and critical conversations about race, privilege, and power? Will you be the first to take a stand even when you are scared? So I really thank you for your time today. I thank you for your commitment to this noble profession and being interested in it and hopefully being really excited about it. I apologize for the pause in the slides. I'm not sure what is going on, but we forged forward, and I thank you again for your time.